Do the books or letters have any hints at what weapon did Sauron use at the final battle of the War of the Last Alliance? And there is one weapon that Sauron is described as using, and it's his hands. He is said to have killed Gil-galad with his burning hands. So Sauron's hands were like fire. So the only actual weapon that Sauron is described in the book as using is his own hands. And I think you have to admit, that's pretty metal. This is Corey Olsen, the Tolkien Professor, and this is Tolkien Support. Okay, Gail Simone asks, does anyone know if the syllabic near reversal of the names Theoden and Denethor was intentional? Yes, so first of all, Gail, I would say I certainly agree with you about the way that those two characters parallel each other. That seems a really important thing. And Denethor, whose despair leads him to madness ultimately in the end. I would say that the relationship between their names is semi-accidental. Tolkien, as always, derived the names of his characters from the languages that he was dealing with. Denethor comes from his own made-up languages. Theoden does not. Theoden comes from Anglo-Saxon. The language of the Rohirrim is essentially Anglo-Saxon. And Theoden in Anglo-Saxon basically means king. As the Tolkien scholar Mike Drought, who's also an Anglo-Saxon scholar, has pointed out, if you go through the names of all of the kings in the history of Rohan, almost all of them have names that mean king. It's like king, son of king, son of king, son of king. Almost the entire genealogy of the kings of Rohan all basically mean king. And Denethor is from the Elvish languages. However, Gail, having said that, is it a coincidence that their names do kind of resonate in that way? No, I don't think it is. Tolkien had a really good ear. He was very sensitive to the sound of words. The way in which their two names involve a lot of the same sound properties kind of shuffled around in different ways is, I think, something that probably would have appealed to him, as he was certainly aware of the way that their two characters were developing. Mars, that is a person named Mars, presumably not the planet. As I rewatch the Lord of the Rings movie, I still wonder, what is Sauron? Human or bad elf or some other creature? Great question. So Sauron is a Maya, an angelic being. He is not a mortal creature, either elf or human. There were in Tolkien's world a lot of these sort of kind of semi-divine creatures, kind of like angels. Sauron was one of these. Some of them, of course, many of them were good. That's what Gandalf is also, one of these same creatures. He is a spiritual being taking physical form. That's why when he dies, because he's actually slain, his body is killed in the battle and his spirit flees. But his spirit is greatly weakened by this, but it's not gone. So he is eventually able, by the time of the Lord of the Rings, he can manifest in a physical body again. All right, Morgan number 5 asks, when Gandalf went from gray to white, was it just a one-off or was it a company-wide promotion? Did Radagast the Brown become Radagast the Gray? It would have been tough for Alatar and Palando going from blue to brown. Okay, good. Excellent question. It is a very natural thing when we read about the color of the wizards to imagine that the wizard's color is a sign of rank and that there is a hierarchy, a strict hierarchy among the colors. Here's how I understand the colors of the wizards. The colors of the wizards are a sign of not of their ranks, but of their roles, of their particular jobs. Saruman had a job. He was the white. And as the White Wizard, he had a job. And his job was to be the enemy of Sauron and to lead the forces of good against Sauron. Saruman gets canned from his job, and Gandalf takes over his job. This is why when Gandalf returns, he's the White, not just because he's more powerful, he is more powerful, but because he has a new role. And he is now the White Wizard, and when he comes back, you'll notice he acts like it. He is in the forefront, leading the good guys overtly as the enemy of Sauron. That is Saruman as he should have been. That is what the White Wizard's job description is. Now, this leads to a very sensible question. What is the job description of the Grey Wizard? What was Gandalf's job before? It seems that his job as the Grey is to go around and encourage and support people, just as Radagast the Brown, his remit is clearly birds and beasts, right? He is the friend of birds and beasts. Gandalf's remit is not birds and beasts, but people. And the way that we see him going, or the kind of relationships that we see him establishing in Gondor, in Lothlorien, in the Shire, suggest that going around and encouraging and supporting these different populations of people, that seems to be, as far as we can tell, what the job description of the Grey Wizard is. So, no, I do not think that all of the wizards get a company-wide promotion. The shift from grey to white is a change in job description for Gandalf, not a rank promotion. So Ryan asks, do they have compasses in Middle-earth? Does Arda get magnetic poles after the Akalabaith? Yes, it has poles. Do they have compasses? I don't think so. We have no references to anybody using compasses. And finding magnetic north, does magnetic north exist? Yes. It certainly does. The reference to does Arda get magnetic poles after the Akalabaith that Ryan asks, of course, the Akalabaith is the story of the downfall of Numenor. The old version of Tolkien's mythology, the Elder Days in Tolkien's world, are a flat earth mythology. They take place on a flat earth. When the island of Numenor is sunk beneath the sea, at the end of the Second Age, the world is made round. So it's not just that the island drops, but the world is made round at that point. So does Arda get magnetic poles at the point when it's made round? Yes, it certainly has them. Does anyone navigate by them? That is not at all clear. So again, there's no explicit references to compasses, but a compass would certainly work in Middle-earth. That seems fairly clear. Okay, a question from Zachariah S. Pumpkins. If the black speech of Mordor is so ugly to listen to, how come it looks so pretty when inscribed upon the One Ring? It's written in Tengwar, but did the black speech have no written components? Was Sauron flexing his calligraphy, or was Elvish his only choice? Really interesting question. That script, of course, was invented by Tolkien. He invented several, not only languages, but also scripts. Sauron devised the black speech because he had an orc problem. He had communication issues. In his armies, the orcs couldn't communicate with each other, so he invents the black speech. In some ways, it actually was kind of a failure as a linguistic experiment by Sauron. The script that fits his language does not fit the work that he wants to do. So the fact that he has to borrow from the elves, borrow their script in order to make his inscription on the ring is a little bit of an indictment against Sauron, and kind of shows, in the end, he can't really create new wonderful things himself. He's not capable of creating beauty. He is in the business of tearing beauty down. All right, John Carney asks the classic and excellent question, what happened to the Entwives? The answer? We don't know. Tolkien was asked this many times. He answered this question a couple times in his letter, and his answer was, I don't know. Though he does say on one or two occasions that he suspects that they're dead. The Entwives lived in the lands down near the Anduin, north of the Argonath, the place that's called the Brown Lands. They're quite close to Mordor, not exactly on the doorstep, but, they're like a suburb of Mordor. Were they all slain by Sauron? Were they scattered, and do they still exist somewhere? Tolkien said he didn't know for sure. It's a mystery. There are several things that he deliberately left mysteries that he said he himself didn't know the answer to. So nobody can give a definitive answer to that question. All right, another question from Signore P. For non-hobbits, can you name one other town or village in the Shire that isn't Hobbiton? Sure, there are lots of towns and villages in the Shire. Mickledelving is the name of the capital of the Shire, essentially. It's the center of the Shire. The two other most important places in the Shire are Buckland, which is the home of the Brandybucks, and Tuckborough, which is the home of the Took family. And there are a number of other towns that they pass through. Bywater, of course, which is right next to Hobbiton. There's Woodall and Stock and several other towns along the way that we hear about during the journey of the hobbits there in the Fellowship of the Ring. All right, Jeff Ehrman asks, I always find it funny that the plural of elf is elves, but the plural for dwarf is dwarfs, not dwarves. Tolkien popularized this. I read that it has to do with the origin of the word, dweorg, Old English, or dwaro. Exactly. So this is something that Tolkien, as a philologist, that is somebody who studied language, quietly rebelled against. It is true that the traditional plural of dwarf, the technically correct plural, is dwarfs. And Tolkien hated that because linguistically it is not sound. It just does not work and doesn't make sense. So he innovated. His pluralization, dwarves, which he insisted on in The Hobbit, is his kind of rebellion against what really is not a very sensible pluralization at all. And actually, it's funny, he had a bunch of arguments with the proofreading staff, especially at Houghton Mifflin, the American publisher, who kept correcting it. Like the copy editors kept going back and changing it to dwarfs, and they'd send him the proofs and he'd be like, guys, no, like, trust me, who's the professor here? This comes in from Kevin Hearn, who asks, I never understood the urgency of hopping on the last boat to Valinor. Why was it the last boat? This is almost certainly a lore thing I missed in the books. Why couldn't Arwen just build a raft and head west later? And hey, Frodo got on a boat. Couldn't Arwen have made that one? So the boats in question are sailing from the havens of the elves, and they are headed into the West, capital W. And when the world was made round, the far west was removed from the world. You can't get there anymore, but one straight path still remains. That is, straight in the sense of being tangential to the sphere of the earth. So the straight road leaves Earth and goes to Valinor, which has been taken apart into a separate place. It's no longer part of the purely physical world anymore, but it is still part of Arda, and there is still a connection. There is still this kind of umbilical cord between the world and Valinor, and that path, that straight road, has been left explicitly in order that the elves who still remain in Middle-earth can still escape and go to the Blessed Realm, go to Elvenhome. They're given by the Valar the privilege of sailing on the straight road. That's where Frodo and Bilbo, with Gandalf and Elrond and the others who depart in the ship there from the harbor at the end of The Lord of the Rings, that's where they're headed. As for Arwen herself, she does not get on a boat because she has chosen mortality. The choice of Arwen is a really big deal. Humans and elves have completely different fates. What happens to elves at the end of the world? The world is going to come to an end, and when it comes to an end, the elves are done. Do they all die? Are all elf souls annihilated at the end of Arda? They don't know. So the big deal when Arwen chooses to marry Aragorn, it's an enormous deal. She is leaving. She is permitted the choice to leave the fate of elves. She ceases to be an elf anymore. She becomes mortal. She embraces mortality and a human fate. And so therefore, she is not going to be going into the West. And when she dies, when her body dies, her spirit is not going to go into the West. That's why such a big deal is made of the farewell between Elrond and Arwen, because he is going to go to Valinor, and he's going to remain there. His spirit will remain there even after his body dies, if his body dies. And Arwen is going to go wherever humans go. Eddie Stanton asks, is there a J.R.R. Tolkien book about the Goblin and Dwarf Great War? Excellent question, to which the unfortunate answer is no, there is no such book. The longest description, the most information we get about the war between the dwarves and the goblins or orcs is in the last section of Appendix A in The Return of the King, is on the people of Durin, and that's where we get the description of the Battle of Azanul-Bazar, to use the dwarfish name for it. It's only about a one-paragraph summary of the war itself, building up to that battle. That was the final battle. In fact, that section of Appendix A is not only the most that we get about that war between the goblins and dwarves, but it's also the most information we get about dwarves, full stop. We learn more in that section of Appendix A than really we learn anywhere else, including The Hobbit. A question from Jacob Williams. Isn't the marring of Arda the doing of Melkor? And the raising of the hands of Eru, the verses of the song fold in his grief to the reconciliation. So Melkor is the big bad of Middle-earth, and I mean big bad of Middle-earth. He is essentially the Satan figure of, the entirety of Tolkien's world. He is the second most powerful creature in existence, second only to God himself. At least in the beginning, he was the second most powerful. He rebelled against God, paralleling the story of Satan in Christian tradition. One of the chief differences between Tolkien's mythology and Christian, Judeo-Christian mythology is that Tolkien describes Melkor as having marred Arda. So Arda, again, is the whole world. It's the solar system. And the entirety of the world has been tainted, essentially, by Melkor's malice. And that's why everything is tending towards decay and tragedy. That's basically why do bad things happen to good people in Middle-earth? Melkor. That's why. Eru, the one, Iluvatar, who is God, he does respond to that. His message to Melkor is, there is nothing that you can do that is ultimately going to mess up my plan for the world. And you will find that everything that you have done to try to mess up Middle-earth is only going to end up contributing to the ultimate beauty and glory of my creation. So Tolkien's theology there is that God is still in charge. Okay, Antonio asks, did Sauron just turn Numenor into a Melkor cult, making human sacrifice in the name of the giver of freedom? Yes. Yes, Antonio, that is exactly what Sauron did. Sauron was extremely cunning. He could not compete with the Númenóreans on a military basis. So Sauron gives in. So they bring him back as a prisoner to Numenor. And he does that because he really wants to go to Numenor. And he works on corrupting it from within. So yes, he turns Numenor into a devil-worshipping cult and ultimately convinces them to attack the last enemy that they have not defeated. The ones who have been doing them wrong all these years, namely the elves and the Valar over in the west. It is really fun to talk about your questions. I really appreciate all the questions that you guys asked here today. It's so interesting, of course, that we're able to still talk about Tolkien, to have these kinds of debates and discussions 80 years later. Well, I'm Corey Olsen, the Tolkien Professor, and this has been Tolkien Support.